local cable stations. That's why we're using microphones. Otherwise, we wouldn't. So it's not like we don't think you can hear us at all. Okay. Okay. So great. Well, thanks all for coming tonight. I'm Kathy. Welcome to the Wellesley Free Library. Oops, sorry. I'm Kathy. Welcome to the Wellesley Free Library. As usual, we have information about the upcoming programs here at the library, and our April tech schedule is out, so if you want to relearn Excel or you want to learn more about Instagram, we have some great workshops, those and others on the calendar this month. Also, we always do a short eval at the end of each program, so we have them on the second table over here. So please, if you'd like, before you leave, fill one out. We'd love to get your feedback about this program. And let's see. Oh, now it is my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Sahil Mehta. He's the founder of MedSchool Coach. He is a nationally known expert in medical school admissions. Dr. Mehta earned a bachelor's degree from Columbia University and his MD from the University of Chicago's Pritzker School of Medicine. He is a board-certified interventional radiologist and an expert in minimally invasive treatments that spare the need for extensive surgery. Dr. Mehta practices at Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center and is on the faculty at the Harvard Medical School. So let's welcome Dr. Sahil. Glad you're here tonight.
Thank you. All right, thanks, Kathy. Obviously, we have a very intimate group, so I kind of put this together aiming a little bit more at the high school crowd, but we can change this to more of the college crowd. Do you guys want to just take a minute to introduce yourself or let me know kind of where you stand?
Hi, I go to Wellesley High School.
Great.
I'm a freshman.
Okay, great. Awesome. Great. So, you know, I'm Sahil. I've been doing this for a while now, which is helping students kind of plan out, get into medical school, right? I started this basically back in 2007 or so now, so it's been about 12 years. And in that time, we've helped over 10,000 students now sort of get through the process, get into medical school. And in that time, I've seen just a huge variety of questions, huge variety of sort of students in unique situations and straight situations, like just everything across the spectrum of students who want to eventually become a physician. And it's a long process, and I'm so glad you're starting so early, you know, as a freshman in high school. Some people don't think about it until after they've even graduated college, and, you know, others obviously in college and as they go through. So what I think I'll do is I will kind of briefly take you through this, but then we can have just a little bit more one-on-one time and sort of talk about any individual situations. I'm happy to do that. But I'll kind of give you a little bit of an overview of the entire sort of pre-med process, right? So what I say is that getting here, as in getting to the hospital and being a practicing physician, is unfortunately not easy. It is a multi-step, multi-year process, right? So obviously you have to go through high school and you have to do well in high school, but then you got to get to college. College is typically 4 years. Then there's post-bac or SMP programs, which those of you who have sons or daughters in college may have sort of been hearing about. Master's programs, special master's programs, post-bac programs, which can be a year or two. Then gap years, which can be 1+ years. Some people take 4 or 5 years before they end up going to medical school. And then medical school, right? So the traditional way is college straight to medical school, and that's how it was done for many, many, many years. But probably in the last 20 years or so, we've sort of inserted these middle components. And not everybody has to go through these middle components, but a lot of students do. A lot of students end up taking gap years. If you look at the average matriculant age to medical school, it's around 25. So that means that most students are taking 2 or 3 years, if not more than that, before they enter medical school after college. So it's becoming sort of this long, drawn-out process, and I'll go over a little bit of why that is. But keep in mind, especially for those of you young, that this doesn't end, right? Once you get into medical school, you're not done. There's, unfortunately, a whole lot more, or fortunately for those of us who take care of patients, right? So you have a year of internship, you have 1 to 6 years of residency, you have 1 to 3 years of a fellowship, and then finally you're an attending. So by the time you get out here, which is practicing medicine on your own without any supervision, you're talking about, at minimum, you're like 32, and that's if you skip everything else in between. More likely, you're really in your late 30s, early 40s before you start becoming an attending and making any money or taking care of patients on your own. Now, Obviously, this timeline is shortened or lengthened depending on the specialty you want to go into. Some specialties are only 3 years of residency. Others are 7, 8 years of residency. Typically, the more subspecialized you are, think neurosurgery, that's a longer track. If you're a primary care doctor, a primary pediatrician, usually around 3 years or so is what you're looking at. So it's a long process, right? That's sort of the bottom line. And what do you need to get here? And this is especially, I think, relevant for our high school students, right? So what do you need? You need brains, right? You can't get there without brains. You've got to be smart. That's the bottom line. Then I say you need heart. You really have to have a desire to go into medicine. If you don't have a desire to go into medicine, forget it. You shouldn't go because it takes too long. It's too arduous a process. So you really have to have heart and want to know medicine is for you. And then I say you got to have lungs, because it's a long process, and you got to basically take some deep breaths along the way and have the stamina to get there. And then I throw in the liver, because there's going to be failures along the way. And for those of you that know, the liver sort of filtrates blood from your body, takes out all the toxins. There are going to be toxins that come along this way, and you need a liver. You're going to have speed bumps in the road on your way to getting into medical school. So you kind of have to have all these things to really get there. So who makes it through, right? Who makes it all the way through to medical school? Less than 25% of students who come in as a freshman in college and say, I'm going to be a physician, end up being a physician. And I think that's probably actually an overestimate. So you have all these students who come in and say, I'm a pre-med. I want to be a doctor, right? They get their freshman year and they say, that's what I want to do. The reality is probably only about 60% of those students even make it to the application process. So you have a huge number of students that kind of get weeded out before then. Maybe during organic chemistry, maybe they find something else that they like, good for them. Not a lot of students end up going through to the application process. Then once you actually even get to the application process, only about 40% of those students are accepted. So of the students who sort of come in and say, hey, I want to be a physician, you have just this tiny number, unfortunately, at the end of the day that get there. And I mean, that's good and bad, right? We don't want everybody, not everybody should be able to get into medical school with ease. At the same time, you can imagine that there's plenty of good people who get weeded out or are not taking the right steps and don't get there. And I want to give, this is a big table, but more relevant for those who have students in college already, which kind of goes through the numbers of those who have actually applied to medical school. And I'll draw your attention, it's basically the MCAT score and the GPA. And I'll draw your attention down here, which is that 40% number, right? 40%. So we had 40,000 acceptances, 95,000 applicants in a given year, right? So you're talking about in that 40% range is the amount of students who end up getting into school. And this, unfortunately, becomes harder and harder every single year. So if I went back and showed you the table from 2015, it's around 43%. If I showed you a table from 2012, it's around 45%. So it's getting harder and harder every single year to get into medical school. This is a great table for those of you guys when your students are ready to apply. It's a little bit early for you, but when your students are actually ready to apply to medical school, understanding where they stand with their GPA and MCAT breakdown, this kind of really gives a great idea. So, and it's competitive, right? You may say, okay, I have a 3.75 GPA. That's a pretty darn good GPA. And let's say you have a 506 MCAT. That's actually somewhere around the 70th percentile for the MCAT, 70th, 80th percentile for the MCAT. So you're talking about a 3.7 GPA and 75th or 80th percentile in the MCAT. Only 50% of those students get into medical school. So it's hard, right? This is a hard process to go through. And then it's not a cheap process to go through either. Student loans, at the end of medical school now are averaging around $250,000 to $300,000. Medical school is expensive. Almost everybody is graduating with debt. You don't make any money as a resident. So all those years I showed you from college until attending, you're not making any money whatsoever. You're making a little bit of money during residency, but it's actually a very small amount. Medical residents working about 80 hours a week, they're making about $14 an hour, so not a lot. Not enough to pay your debt back, certainly. So it's really not until the end of your training that you can even start. So at this point, when I give this talk, parents usually start looking like this. because they're like, wow, this is a hard thing for my son or daughter to get through. What can I do is the question that they ask. And a couple of things I want to emphasize. Obviously support and nurture them as you would as parents. And I say let them explore. So, particularly those of students who are in high school, there's a lot of pressure sometimes for that student to go into medicine. And as I said, and as I mentioned, that I think you really need heart and you really want to make sure this is for you. And so I think as a parent, particularly if a parent of a younger child, I would really let them explore. Let them explore other fields and make sure that medicine is for them. If at the end of that they say, listen, I really want to do this, awesome. At that point, you start planning early, and I think you get them the guidance that you need, either through people like us or guidance counselors, friends who are physicians, things like that. Another thing I throw in here is be realistic, because I have a lot of parents who are not realistic. They think that their son or daughter is the brightest, most talented person in the entire world, and the reality is there are a lot of really smart, talented people out there, and most people's son or daughter are great, but they're not necessarily perfect. And so if your son or daughter's GPA is low, if their MCAT score is low, I think you have to be realistic with them and kind of, give them a realistic picture of how difficult this is. So for those of you that are younger, I put this up, is this really for you, right? How do you know that medicine is for you? And I've thrown up a couple of things up here, and some of these are things that I think you should do to make sure medicine is for you, and others are things that if you say this is what I want to go into medicine for, you're making the wrong decision, right? So as a young high school student, or even as a earlier student in college, have you shadowed? Have you made sure that being a physician is what you want to do? Have you seen what the practice is really like? Do you want to make money? Is that why you're going into this field? Because that's a bad idea. I'll tell you that right now. Are your parents doctors? Is that why you want to go into the field? Also a bad idea. Good to sort of get early exposure, but not good to say, well, my dad or mom is a doctor, and that's why I want to be a doctor. Have you explored other careers? Really emphasize this because I think everybody should explore other careers before they decide to dive into medicine. And if you're not sure, that's totally okay, right? Not everybody needs to make a decision in their freshman year of high school or even their freshman year of college if medicine is what they want to do. You have plenty of time to decide that later on. I throw up this money thing just for a second because this was a sort of hypothetical, or unhypothetical scenario that somebody ran through a couple of years ago, which is who makes more money, a UPS driver or a physician at the end of the day? And they basically charted out what they thought would happen. And basically you see for the physician, obviously there's debt, and you don't start making money until you're many years out of high school. And then you obviously accelerate and can make a very good living, don't get me wrong. But you can't do this for the money because there's so many other fields that are going to make more money. In fact, this sort of study or scenario that this person ran showed that if you're a UPS driver making $16 an hour, at the end of the day, and you started at the same time that somebody started college, you would end up making more money if you worked doctor-like hours. So, and even if you worked doctor-like hours, it would be approximately 16 or 20 years after high school that you finally caught up to that person. So food for thought, right? And again, not to discourage anybody, I love my job, I love medicine, but I want to make sure that everybody who's going into this field truly is passionate about it because these are the realities. So what's it going to take, right? So great grades, a great MCAT score. MCAT is the standardized test that you have to take. Similar to the SAT or ACT, MCAT is what you're going to have to take before you get into medical school. Grades, keeping your grades up, 4.0, 3.8, above is sort of really what you need to be aiming for in order to kind of have a competitive application at the end of the day. Extracurriculars, I'm going to talk about that on a separate slide, but you guys have all heard how important extracurriculars are in sort of your medical school application probably. We'll talk about that a little bit more. I put up desire because I want to emphasize just how important it is to make sure that this is what you want to do. Story. So even if you've had all of these other things, if you have the great grades, if you have the great MCAT score, it's not enough. You have to put your application together in a way that's going to set you apart. comparatively to the other 90,000 students who are applying. And so putting together your story, figuring out how it is that you're going to position yourself in the medical school application is really important. And then performance is because medical school is one of the only professional schools, or one of the professional schools, that has an interview as an integral part of if you get into the school or not. So even if you've done all this other great stuff, and we see a ton of applicants who've done great stuff, they end up struggling at the interview stage because they just have sat in the library for the last 4 years and done nothing else, and they can't talk to anybody. So this all is kind of what it's going to take to eventually get into school. So to talk a little bit about the extracurriculars that students should have, and honestly, this goes for a high school student as well as a college student, right? If you're a high school student thinking about, hey, how am I going to get into the best college I can? How am I going to get into a direct medical program? These are kind of the same things that anybody's looking for. So shadowing is important. Observing physicians, seeing a spectrum of physicians, making sure that you've seen an outpatient physician, an inpatient physician, maybe a surgeon. That way that a medical school can really say, okay, you know what? This person has clearly demonstrated an interest. Research. Research is really important because it's sort of that it proves to us that that student is taking extra initiative, that that student is a scientific thinker, that they can do hypothesis-driven research, because at the end of the day, how do we advance medicine? More and more research. All medical schools are associated with, obviously, universities, which have professors, which do research. This is sort of their bread and butter. Volunteer work, altruism, needed. You have to show that this is something that you are doing, that you want to give back to your community, to international community, whatever it might be. Leadership, showing that you've had a couple of leadership experiences over the course of your application is super important. Again, medicine and medical schools want people who are going to be leaders in their field. They want to get the cream of that crop. They want to make sure that you're really going to be able to sit across from a patient and then talk to them in a meaningful way, and not simply be somebody who's too shy, not able to sort of connect with that patient. And then clinical work. So clinical work is actually doing something with patients, right? Actually being somebody who's taking care of patients, whether it be as a hospice volunteer, whether it be as a hospital volunteer, whether it be as an EMT. So you're actually taking care of patients. And so these are the pillars for college students that every medical school is going to want to see. For a high school student, if you're going into medicine, and eventually want to go into medicine, when you get to college, you have to think about all these things. But even in high school, if you're thinking about, hey, I want to go to the best possible pre-med college I can, I want to go to a direct BSMD program or direct medical program, these are all the same things that you kind of need to show a medical school or a college. Choosing colleges. So, you can start this process early. And again, I sort of focus this on a little bit of high school students because you need to understand that choosing colleges is one of the first things that you can do to be a successful pre-med. And for those of you guys who already have sons or daughters in college, don't worry. Even if you chose whatever college, you can get into medical school. But if you're early, choosing a great college is really important, or choosing the right college is important. And so this is the question that comes up all the time. Should I go to generic university, and I put generic university because it can be anything, or should I go to a place like Harvard, et cetera, right? Big name place where I can get into. And there are pros and cons of each, but what I'll go back to is saying that one of the most important things, or probably the most important thing in your application, is your grades, right? Along with your MCAT, your grades are your most important thing. So I get students every single day of the week who come and tell me, oh, I went to Berkeley, I went to MIT, and those schools were incredibly hard, and I graduated with a 3.4. Versus, my cousin went to University of blah, 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 and got a 4.0. Don't I get extra points for going to Berkeley? Don't I get extra points for going to MIT? And the reality is no, you don't. There's too many great schools across the country. That 4.0 is almost always going to win out. Now, if you went to Harvard and have a 4.0, and somebody else went to UMass and had a 4.0, yeah, the Harvard student looks very impressive next to them. But if you have a UMass student who has a 4.0 and a Harvard student who has a 3.4, the UMass student in medical school admissions is going to win out every single day of the week. So there are pros and cons, right? And I'm not saying that you should choose a quote unquote lesser school. There's no lesser schools. It's what's the best fit for you, right? Where are you going to perform the best is what's really important when choosing colleges. So does that mean you want to be a big fish in a small pond? Do you perform better in a much smaller, more intimate environment where there's 20 students per class? Maybe a small liberal arts college is better for you. Or are you somebody who's going to thrive in a place where there's 300, 400 kids in your introductory science classes, but you can really do well? So choosing colleges, I think, is one of a very important part in the process. And then again, for those who are sort of younger, there are these things called direct medical programs. Have you heard of direct medical programs or BSMD programs? So these are programs where you can apply essentially to medical school right out of high school. You still have to go through the undergrad, but basically they're programs that have dedicated seats in their medical school class awaiting you. So for instance, Brown, if you apply to the Brown PLME program, you basically take 4 years at Brown and you're guaranteed a seat at Brown's medical school. Same with Northwestern. There are others that actually even have 2 colleges involved. So Siena, for instance, if you go to Siena, you can be guaranteed a seat at Albany Med in this select program. Now these are very, very competitive programs, right? So the people who get into these programs are the same students who are getting into Harvard and MIT and Tufts and all these great schools out of college. So you cannot expect to get into these programs unless you have an awesome SAT score, unless you have an awesome GPA, class rank, et cetera. Now, for those of you guys who are a little bit further along, here are some words that you may hear. Allopathic schools, MD schools, osteopathic schools, DO schools, international schools like Ross and St. George's, and then there's other schools, right, like allied health professional schools, PA, NP, things like that. And I throw these all up there because these are just some of the words that your sons or daughters may come home with and say, hey, my guidance counselor recommended that I apply to osteopathic school. Or he or she may say, I don't want to apply to osteopathic school. And we can get in, I think, in a one-on-one setting a little bit more about what this means. But the bottom line is that for any student, if you get into a US-based MD or DO school, you've done great. You've really done awesome, and you're going to be a practicing physician in the United States and have no issues whatsoever later. International schools are a little bit different story. There are a lot of students who end up in international school because they couldn't get in to a USMD school, so they say, okay, I'm going to go down to the Caribbean, St. George's, Ross University, or some of the big ones down there, and come back with an MD degree. It's a little trickier. It can be done, but it's a little trickier. But it's something that you may hear about or come across as you guys go through the process. So, I didn't want to take too long on the presentation because I just wanted to give a short little grand overview of things. I will direct you guys who are younger or even your sons and daughters who are older. There's a couple of great resources we have. Prospective Doctor is particularly good. This has literally thousands of free articles that are written by admissions committee people on how to get into medical school, how to choose the right extracurricular activities, how to write a good letter of recommendation, how to figure out your school list, et cetera. So no matter where you are, if you're in high school or in college, this is an awesome resource that I would really you should go to. We also have a podcast where we talk with admissions people, we talk with physicians, talk about career, talk about the MCAT, talk about tips and tricks on how to do well on that and all that. MedSchool Coach is our company. We're the ones who sort of take it a step further. If somebody needs one-on-one help, if somebody needs to be mentored through the process, somebody has a specific question, we act as guidance counselors. We act above and beyond the counselors sort of at school, because the counselors at school oftentimes are very good, but oftentimes are either overwhelmed working with pre-law and pre-dental and pre-this and that. These students, we really just focus in on medical students, so we kind of help with that. But Prospective Doctor is definitely something I would recommend checking out no matter where you are on the spectrum of applying to school. So hopefully I've scared you guys enough, but given at least some information. Again, given that it's such a small, intimate group, I think it's probably reasonable for me to just kind of open it up to questions. I'm happy to answer general questions, specific questions, whatever it might be for you guys.
What's the best
Yeah.
What's the best things to be doing?
So what are the best things to be doing in gap years? And this really depends on where you are as a student. So if you're a student, let's say, who has a 3.4 GPA and wants to get into medical school, the best utilization of your gap year is going to be doing an academic program, doing a special master's program, getting an additional degree, taking classes that are with medical students, right? And so that may be the best utilization. Let's say you're a student, though, who has a great GPA, 3.9 GPA, but is really lacking in clinical experience. Then maybe the gap year should be used to be a scribe. Maybe the gap year should be used to do research, like dedicated research for an entire year, because when you can do dedicated research for an entire year, you can pump out publications, which you couldn't do during the course of undergrad when you only have a couple of weeks here and there. So there's a wide spectrum of things that people do during these gap years: academics, research, clinical work, international work, and all of them have some benefit. But it really depends on the particular person, the particular student, and where they stand for me to tell you what the best utilization of those 1 or 2 years may be. So for you who are early in high school, right, what has you interested in medicine? Like, what have you done? What have you looked at?
So last summer I did a summer camp. It was an anatomy research camp.
Cool.
And that was really cool, and I was really interested.
Awesome.
I got to look at different diseases and did a lot of research. And I worked with older students who are actually trying to pursue a career in medicine. So I was really inspired. That's why.
That's great. So yeah, we hear so many stories of people who are coming younger and younger and younger, right, to us, and just getting interested in medicine at a younger and younger age. And so I don't think everybody needs to be that by any means. You know, your sons and daughters may have not thought about this until later, and that's totally fine. But for you who've thought about this super early, that's awesome. You should continue exploring the career, though, right? Anatomy is great, but it's not necessarily what you're going to do as a doctor, right? So for the next couple of years, you should really take some time, explore the career, shadow some physicians, and see what else is out there and make sure that this is what you want to do. And if it is, awesome, because the earlier you think about it, freshman in college, if you know that you are going to apply to medical school, you can take the right steps early on. So the other thing that we see all the time is people who are students who are freshmen in college and then kind of mess up their first year, their second year. And then it makes it much harder to get back on track, right? They haven't taken the right courses, or they took courses that were too difficult for them, and then all of a sudden their grades tanked, and now they have to kind of dig themselves out of the hole. You can do it, you can dig yourself out of the hole, but it makes it much harder. So if you know that medicine is what you want to do, planning early and making sure in the, let's say, freshman year of college, you take the right courses. And it's not just about taking the prereq courses, it's about choosing the right combination of courses, getting involved in the right activities, making sure that you're setting yourself up for success when you take your MCAT in your junior year or your senior year. All those are important steps that you can take super early. And those who do plan ahead definitely tend to do better in the process, right? I mean, if you plan ahead and make sure that you've taken the right steps, you're going to do well in this process.
How do I shadow physicians? Am I allowed to in my freshman year?
Yeah, that's a great question. So shadowing physicians is unfortunately becoming tougher. And the reason it's becoming tougher is because all hospitals have XYZ rules about HIPAA and JCO and all this stuff. So it unfortunately does become a little bit harder. Now for you, you're going to be able to participate in programs, right? So for instance, Beth Israel has a summer program just for high school students where you can go and sort of participate. So that's kind of one of the best ways, particularly in the Boston area where so many hospitals are academic and have a lot of, let's say, red tape behind them, and there's not a lot of freestanding practices. That said, you should also kind of, talk to your pediatrician, talk to your internist, and say, hey, I'm home for the summer. I would love to shadow or spend a couple hours with you. Is that okay, or do you know anybody else? So it's a lot of times just cold calling, network kind of things that can get the opportunities. But if you're young enough, or if you find programs like the BI summer program, it's a great program to get involved with. You can get exposed to a much wider audience.
College?
So that's the ideal time to take it. I shouldn't say ideal. That's the earliest time that somebody should really think about taking it. What's the ideal time? You have to be done with all your prereqs. You have to have had some time to study for it. And it really depends on if you're planning on a gap year or not, right? So some students are planning on a gap year early, and they say, I know I'm going to take that gap year, in which case maybe senior year is actually the best time to take it. So the way the application process works, it's almost an 18-month process. So you have to kind of take your MCAT by the summer of the year before you enter. So if I wanted to enter medical school in 2020, I would take my MCAT in April, May, June of this year for next year's incoming class. So it really depends a little bit on if you're taking that gap year or not, if you want to take that gap year or not, but junior year is the earliest that you would think about taking it. You know, the prereqs, bio, orgo, physics, biochem, sociology, psychology, there's a lot of prereqs that people have to go through and take all these prereqs prior to even thinking about taking and sitting for the MCAT. And I always say the best studying for the MCAT are those prereq classes, right? Courses are great, but they're great as an adjunct to it. You really have had to take classes and do well in those classes before that. Other questions?
Organic chemistry seems to be
Yeah, it's the weed out class.
It's what?
It's the weed out class, yeah. So organic chemistry is always the weed out class. It's historically been that. That's what it always is, which is too bad because organic chemistry has nothing to do with what we do in medicine on a day-to-day basis whatsoever. I couldn't tell you a single thing about organic chemistry, but that is kind of the reality that, that's the class that kind of makes or breaks a lot of pre-med's dreams. And so, if they don't do well in that orgo, they are in that 40% who end up dropping out of the medicine pathway very quickly.
It's just too hard.
Yeah, they kind of get there and they say, this is not worth it, this is too hard. Or they just don't do well and they realize that, if I didn't do well, I'm not going to be able to get in. So doing well in orgo is definitely a hurdle and one of the first things that students should think about, or once they get into that orgo class, like making sure if medicine is what they want to do, that maybe they've even lightened their semester a little bit because they're taking orgo 1 and orgo 2 for that, for those 2 semesters. Maybe not taking 6 other bio classes at the same time because you're really going to be stuck behind. And orgo, unfortunately, requires a lot of memorization, right? It's a lot of sort of just understanding the mechanisms and memorizing names and memorizing reactions and things along those lines. So it just takes time more so than anything else.
Mostly what the MCAT is too, memorization, like holding on to years and years of academics?
Not totally. So the SAT, very reasoning based, right? In theory, you should be able to go and take the SAT without really reviewing anything because it's sort of reasoning based. Now, obviously, you need to know some stuff before you go in there. The MCAT is not a completely memorization based test, but it's not a completely reasoning-based test either. It's somewhere in between. So you have to have the foundational knowledge and aspects of a lot of science and a lot of physics and a lot of psychology, sociology before you take it, but it's not necessarily rote memorization. It's more the understanding of the concepts. So you have to have that basic foundation, but then be able to apply that. So that's why I say it's kind of that mixture of a memorization test, but also sort of an applied reasoning test at the end of the day. Great. So, hopefully this is helpful. Tracy is here from our team as well. Tracy is our student success director. She works with our students and our parents, actually, a whole lot throughout the entire process. We kind of help through the entire journey from students who are as young as high school up until those who are actually in medical school. So we kind of do the entire spectrum. We do MCAT help, we do admissions help, we do USMLE, which is the board exams that you're eventually going to take. This is like 10, 15 years away from you, so don't worry. But those are the kinds of things. So we kind of help in the entire spectrum of getting somebody through the process of becoming a physician. And we've had some really great results based on that, mostly because of that early planning. Again, guidance counselors at school can be really great, but they often are giving poor advice. there are two spectrums, right? They can be really bad and be giving bad advice. They can be good, or but not necessarily have the time to devote. And some of them are fantastic and fabulous, but we definitely see a lot of students who unfortunately don't have the correct guidance through the process, and those are the students that end up falling through, just because that, unfortunately, that guidance counselor, that pre-health advisor just doesn't have the time to spend with them or doesn't know the process that well. Again, they're working with students through law school, they're working with students through business school, they're sort of just pre-professional advisors, not necessarily med school specific. So that's why I think we kind of have much better success rates when we're able to get those students and work with them early. And then for high school students, we tend to, again, work with them early, particularly if they want to go into a BSMD program or know that medicine is what they want to do. We can take them through, make sure you're choosing the right college, make sure you're talk about if BSMD versus direct med or versus traditional pathway is right for you, and figure out the right things to do in the summer of 9th grade, 10th grade, 11th grade to get to the best school to get eventually to medical school. So that's, I mean, it's a long process, as I kind of outlined, and we get students throughout every aspect of it. Eventually we get them into medical school, but the earlier we can get them, the earlier we can talk to them, the earlier we can plan, the better in the whole process.
You're talking about volunteering.
Mm-hmm.
Is any volunteering like soup kitchens or does it have to be like direct patient care?
So that's a great question, and any volunteering is helpful, right? The next step, though, in any of the extracurriculars is not just checking off the boxes, but it's putting together a story, right? So what is it that Jake brings to the table, right? How is it that he or she is putting together all those extracurricular activities into a story that's compelling for medical school? It's the same thing as college, right? So if you're applying to college and you've just checked off all the boxes, that's great. But the top schools in the country are looking for a little bit more than that, right? They're looking for some kind of story, some kind of cohesive understanding of who you are and why you're going to make a great physician or a great applicant to their school. So that's a long-winded answer of saying all volunteering is great. It does not have to necessarily be medically related, particularly because we have other things that have to be medically related, like clinical research, like shadowing. So the volunteering doesn't have to be. And sometimes it's actually better if it's not, right? I mean, I'll tell you, when I did the whole process, all my volunteering was, not a single thing was with patients. It was teaching. I love to teach, and that was sort of how I shaped my application. That I did Teach for America, I was in the inner city, all that kind of stuff. Like, that's how I shaped my application, and that's what sold medical schools that, hey, this is somebody who brings something to the table. Now, if I tried to sell them on, hey, I just volunteered and pushed the patient around the hospital or worked in the gift shop at the hospital, I wouldn't have come up with a good story. So even though that is a more hospital-related experience, for me, at least in the story that I put together, this was now 20 years ago, but the story I put together was more compelling because I wanted to sell myself as a teacher. Like, that's what I came across as. And so I did volunteering in that, or because of the volunteering I did in that, that was a story I put together at the end of the day. So it's all about sort of that story that ends up being put together, not just going through the check boxes.
Sahil, the application process for applying to medical school is somewhat unique. Maybe you could just spend a minute talking about how that works and how that's different than applying to other types of
Sure.
college.
Yeah, so applying to medical school is, as I said, an 18-month process almost, if not more than that. So it's a long process, and it has many components to it. We have what's called like a primary application, which is basically a centralized application that goes to all different schools across the country. Then each school sends you what's a secondary application or a supplemental application. And so if you think about the timeline of all this, this typically starts in June of the year before you are going to go and start medical school. So in June of the year before, you start to fill out your primary application. Then around August or so, you start getting the secondary applications from schools, and that's after you've sent the schools the letters of recommendation. That's after you sent them the transcript. They'll send you an additional few essays to write. Then they sit down and evaluate you, and by September or so, you may be called for an interview. The interview season lasts anywhere from September all the way to March, and then hopefully after that, you have an acceptance. Just because you get an interview does not mean you get an acceptance. some schools have probably a 10-20% rate of interviews to acceptances. Others are more in the 30% range. So if you get an interview, 30% of those students eventually get into that school. But it's a long process, because by the time you're going to have wait lists, you're going to write some letters of intent. These are all things that kind of come across when you eventually are thinking about the application and what you have to do. But that's I would say, grand overview of the process. Did I answer the question, Tracy? I don't know if I live in this, so it's like this is all I think about. Other programs have, I guess, a much more truncated, application window, right? You apply, and then 6 months later, at the most, you're sort of into the school. For medical school, it's just a much more prolonged process that it takes to go through the application phase and get in. Great. Awesome. So hopefully that was helpful in some way. Again, check out those resources, and particularly Prospective Doctor. I think it's an awesome resource that really has just tons and tons of free information. We have our free podcasts, free videos, all this stuff. We kind of just give out and give information to students, and we want them to just learn and go through the process. And if you, at the end of that, you look at it and say, "Ugh, I need more," that's where we're here for you. But, it's a long and arduous process. For you who are thinking about it super early, congratulations, that's great. Explore the career, make sure you're kind of applying to the right colleges. You could ask us about sort of the right colleges, because there are really good pre-med colleges, there are bad pre-med colleges. There's great schools you can go to, direct med or otherwise. And for those who have sons or daughters a little bit later on, it's a hard process, but you get there, particularly with early planning. Your daughter wants to do study abroad.
The SMD program seems like smart, because then you don't have to worry about the application process.
It is, in some ways, if you know 100% that medicine is what you want to do. Because if you think 95% medicine is what you want to do, I've seen plenty of students on that 5% who are now stuck in a school. And so, again, remember, the people who are getting into those programs are the same people who are getting to Harvard and Duke and all the great schools across the country, right? So they kind of had a choice when they came out of high school to go to, let's say, Duke or Harvard or MIT versus go to a direct medical program. And if they chose a direct medical program, usually they're choosing I put this in quotes because I don't think there's any bad schools out there, but a lesser known school, right? They may be going to a Siena, they may be going to a Union College. Those schools are, just don't carry the name cachet if you end up not doing medicine that Harvard would, right? So you kind of are pinning yourself in that scenario. So if you are not 100% sure medicine is what you want to do, then I don't recommend BSMD programs, actually. I would much rather a student go to college, explore, see different careers, and then say, you know what, medicine is what I want to do. Just locks you in when you don't necessarily have to be. If you're 100% sure, then yeah. And there's some great BSMD programs, Brown, Northwestern, but the acceptance rates to those are in the less than 2% range, far less than 2%. So they're very, very competitive programs.
Is there money for med school like they do, like if you did a master's, people pay for your master's? Is there a way of doing that to be a doctor?
The only way that somebody is truly going to pay for your medical school is if you are part of what's called an MD PhD program. So that's a program where the government has actually funded your participation in the program. Now those programs are actually 7-8 years long, if not longer, and you're kind of committing to a career in research, or at least part of career in research. So that's really the only place where you can have a quote unquote free education. That said, you can have there's military scholarships. So there are people who will get into medical school and then commit to X amount of time in the military after that, and the military or the Navy or whomever will pay for an education as long as they've committed to that time to serve, give back after that. So those are options for people who, where it's tougher to obviously afford. There's grants, there's loans, there's all kinds of, the usual financial aid stuff is all there, but it is an expensive process, so people do look for some of these alternative pathways. I would say the two most popular are the military programs, and then also there's a program, and the exact name is eclipsing my head, but basically there are actually programs at different cities and states where you can, again, commit to spending some time in an underprivileged area or underserved area, and they will pay substantial portions of your medical education or pay back your debt if you've decided that, hey, I'm going to spend 2 or 3 years in this federally qualified healthcare center after practicing. That's another way that people sort of will get that off their back. There are possibilities. Awesome. So we have a little book. It's printed out. It's more for high school students. We also have a whole bunch of other free guides and stuff that we're happy to send you. There's a little website on the thing. If you just want to go there and fill out your name, we can send you a whole bunch of stuff. We have actually one that's more focused on college students as well. So feel free to just drop your name on that. We can send that to you. And then we also have MCAT resources and all that kind of stuff as well that we can send over for those who are close to taking the MCAT. All right. All right. I appreciate you guys coming, and hopefully this was helpful. And I'll stick around if there's any more intimate questions. I'm happy to answer as well. All right.